This is part 3, where I start with the stubborn crankshaft pulley nut. Once that's mastered, it's on to the following. Bring the engine to top dead centre on the compression stroke, remove the crankshaft pulley, remove the i-VTEC solenoid valve, remove the engine bracket, and remove the timing chain case and timing chain. So here's an overview of the engine since I last worked on it, and the idea here is to end with removing the timing chain. So first I will bring the engine to top dead centre on the compression stroke. So if you look at the crankshaft pulley, you'll see there's a group of 3 notches. The centre of those 3 is 8 degrees before top dead centre. The notch we're interested in is a separate notch above, and that is the notch for top dead centre. Here's the arrow in the case and the edge of the crankshaft pulley. So we need to rotate the crankshaft until the single notch, which is the top dead centre notch, is lined up with the arrow that's cast into the timing chain case, like it is here. So if we look down from the top of the engine, where the timing chain is, and rotate the crankshaft pulley with a 19mm socket, we can then rotate the engine until we get the top dead centre mark. So ignore those first 3, and it's the single one we need, which means the engine's now at top dead centre, but it could be on the compression stroke or the exhaust stroke, so we may need to rotate this once again. As I just said, the engine is now at top dead centre, which means cylinder 1 and cylinder 4 is at top dead centre, but we don't know if cylinder 1 is on the compression or exhaust stroke. To establish that, we now need to inspect the various marks on the exhaust and intake camshaft sprockets. Also, the cam lobes should be pointing away from the valves if they are in the closed position. Here is a photo showing the camshaft sprockets at top dead centre on the compression stroke for cylinder number 1. To establish that cylinder 1 is on the compression stroke, we need the top dead centre mark on the crank pulley lined up and the punch mark and arrow on the sprockets pointing up. The 2 lines on the camshaft sprockets should also be aligned next to each other. The lobes on the camshafts should then be pointing away from the valves. On a cold engine, the cam followers would also have some play, as the valves would be closed, being that the piston was on the compression stroke. Rotate the engine 360 degrees if the above isn't the case. I've used a mirror here opposite the camshaft sprockets, so you can see that the 2 lines must be lined up with each other at the 3 and 9 o'clock position. So cylinder 1 should have some very slight movement in the cam followers if it's on the compression stroke. Now cylinder 1 is at top dead centre, we can remove the infamous 19mm crankshaft pulley bolt. I underestimated this task, and in hindsight I think I would have upped my tooling to 3/4 inch, or considered a torque multiplier. There are a great many videos of people struggling to undo this nut. Took me 24 hours. So I think it's safe to assume I didn't do it the best or right way. The theory is this: bring the engine to top dead centre and use a long and substantial breaker bar with close fitting tools. If using an extension bar, then rest it on an axle stand. Use the Honda tool with 50mm hexagonal ends to prevent the crankshaft rotating while inserting a 19mm socket that fits inside it to undo the bolt. They then advise replacing the bolt as it's a highly stressed fastener. So I start off as the Haynes manual suggests, which is to use the 50mm hexagonal locking tool on the crankshaft pulley. That item was laser 3760 and was about £45. I then insert my 19mm long reach socket through the tool onto the pulley. And then I use my big 3/4 inch Koken bar, which is about 3 foot long, and the extensions are twisting, so it's not going to move it. I then move on to my SIP impact wrenches. Now this one here is 1125 Newton meters, and it's not moving it. This is another one. This is a bit smaller at 678 Newton meters, and that didn't move it. I then decided to heat it up with a hot gun. Gave it a good while on that, and then resorted back to the Koken bar. And you can see the engine's moving up, but it's not coming undone. So back onto the impact wrenches. Nothing. So then I try again with the Koken bar, and as you can see, those extensions are just twisting. So I'm very fearful that they might actually shatter. So I then heat it up with MAP gas, and back on the impact wrench again. Nothing. Eventually I go back to the Koken bar, and then it starts moving the car. Back onto the impact wrench. Nothing. Back onto the Koken bar. We do get some movement though. Creak. It's moving. Right, so then I go on to the Koken bar again, using the method that you're supposed to use, and my bars are still twisting, so they're still not going to do it. So now I use my Clark extendable ratchet, which is 3/4 inch, and we have the crankshaft pulley bolt off now. Just so you know that in the Haynes manual it says this bolt is torqued to 245 Newton meters, which doesn't seem that tight, so I would have thought it would have actually come undone a lot easier. So there's the bolt, quite a hefty bolt, but if you look at the edges, that impact wrench has basically made all the edges sharp and pointy by constantly hitting it backwards and forwards, trying to jar it loose. I think perhaps a torque multiplier might have been the answer on this. I'd really like to see now how a torque multiplier would have worked on that. Now remove the crankshaft pulley and the locating key. These are sometimes called a harmonic balancer, as you have an inner hub and an outer ring with a rubber bonding in between. The purpose is to reduce engine vibration and prevent premature crankshaft failure due to the vibration. So I've painted the locating key white so that it's easier to show. I'll point to it now with a pencil. There it is. So make sure you don't lose that. And here's a photo to show the different parts of the crankshaft pulley. The locating key will probably fall out as you take the pulley off, because the pulley is quite easily pulled off. Doesn't require any tools. So make sure you keep that with the pulley, because you don't want to lose that, because that's essential on putting the pulley back on. So the pulley's off now. So there it is. And with the pulley removed, you can now see the crankshaft position sensor and also the oil seal. Now to remove the i-VTEC solenoid valve. Use a 10mm socket to undo the 3 bolts. Here's the location of the valve. It's at the rear of the engine by the timing chain, and you can just see the exhaust on the right hand side. And here's a wider angle view of the valve. So the i-VTEC solenoid valve is held on with 3 long bolts at the rear of the engine. Here I'm taking off the side bolt, which to be honest I don't think you actually need to do. This was a short bolt, and I think it just holds the cover in place that protects it from the heat of the exhaust. So you probably want to leave that one in and just remove the 3 main bolts that are at the back. The 3 bolts are actually in tighter than you would think. Whether it was because it was at the back of the engine, so trying to get leverage was hard, I'm not sure, but I started off with 1/4 inch, and as you can see I'm really quite struggling there. So I then upped it to a 3/8 ratchet, That gave me that little extra leverage just to crack those bolts loose. So you may want to start with the 3/8 on that. So as you can see, they're fairly long bolts, those. There we are, so that's bolt number 1 out. So just 2 more to go. So using a mirror is quite handy here. Just better see where those extra bolts are. Gives you some idea. And here's the second bolt. Same length as the first one. Just confirm that. Always worth checking that they are the same length, because you never know, you may get a shorter one. Looking for bolt number 3. Okay, so this is bolt number 3, the last bolt. Now as the solenoid valve comes out, there will be a little bit of oil leakage. So just try and mop that up. So here's the solenoid valve. And you can see the oil at the bottom. I'm just going to put that extra little bolt back in, because that only holds the cover on. So I don't think you need to remove that. So I've got a bit of tissue. You might be able to see the strainer at the bottom. Now when we put this back onto the engine, we will need to replace that seal. So yeah, there's a little strainer there to protect the device. So there you go. So that's the solenoid valve. Next is the engine mount next to the timing chain. For this you need a 17mm long reach socket for the 2 nuts and 1 bolt. You will need to support the engine at this point from underneath. I used a bottle jack to support the bottom of the engine where the sump is. Now because my bottle jack is like an axle type for a van, I used a rubber hockey puck just on the top there to stop it damaging the bottom of the sump. Okay, so we can now take the bracket off. So access is easier if you just lift out the power steering reservoir. There we are. Just pop that to the side and there's the engine mount. So using a 17mm long reach, we can undo the first nut. Now the nuts actually do have a different depth to them, as I'll show. That one's got a very long bolt to it. Almost, my long reach didn't really reach. Wasn't quite long enough for that. The engine's now moving. So this is the one nut. Now that's quite a short nut. Now this is the bolt. So that's the bolt just come out. And then we have one more nut, and it's quite a deep nut. There we are. So that's a deeper nut than the other one. So then we can just lift the engine bracket out of the way. It's still got an earth cable attached to it, but we can lift that up and just tuck it to the side. The engine bracket is next to come off. This is secured with 3 long bolts that require a 14mm socket and or spanner. I found one bolt to be really awkward to get to. Here you can see the engine bracket with the awkward bolt. So there's only 3 bolts holding this bracket on, though one of them is somewhat sunken into the actual body of the mount. Now I could get a socket in there if it was actually attached to a spanner, so that was like a low profile setup, but then as I unwound, the spanner would then hit the edge of the engine bay, so then I couldn't get the spanner off. So I resorted in the end to jacking the engine up to try and give me some more clearance. So that's one of the easier bolts out, and this is the second one, which isn't too bad. Handy to have small hands here. So those are both the same length. So it's just that one awkward one. If you notice, I keep jacking the engine up. Not sure whether that is actually a good idea, but didn't really have much choice. It was the only way I was going to be able to actually get a socket in there to undo that. And there's the third bolt. And there's the brackets. So I'll put the nuts back on so I don't lose those. And put that bolt back in. Next up for removal is the VTEC oil control solenoid valve. This is held in with just a single 10mm bolt. Here's a photo with the solenoid valve highlighted in yellow. So the bolt was easy enough to come out here, just a 10mm bolt, no problem. Now the actual valve itself rotated quite easily, but that was a bit stubborn to want to come out. So that may take a little while fiddling at, because you don't want to damage the connector on it or anything. But it was quite stuck in there and just kept rotating. So eventually it did come out, and that's the solenoid valve there. Probably need to put that somewhere very safe. Timing chain cover is held on with 16 bolts and requires a 10mm socket. There are 11 standard bolts, 2 bolts with shoulders and 3 bolts going up from the sump pan, and 3 short bolts for the tensioner cover plate. Here's a photo to help you identify where the bolts are. It was a bit impractical for me to try and get a camera into that area to show me removing the bolts, so I've skipped that part and have just removed all the bolts. So I just need to tap the cover to break the seal on it. So using a piece of wood there and a small hammer just to gradually tap it. And if you keep doing that, it gradually peels away from the side of the engine. You've obviously got to be very gentle because you don't want to crack that cover. It is only aluminium. And then carefully lift the cover out. And there's the timing chain cover. So I don't think you actually need to remove the tensioner cover, that little black plate, which is held on with 3 short bolts. That you can probably leave in place. So I'll put that back on. And then I'll put each of the bolts back in to show where they go. So these 3 at the bottom are threaded all the way. and those go up from the sump pan. That's 3 of those. And there's 2 bolts with like shoulders on. So that's the normal bolts. And these have got a shoulder on, and they're the ones at the very bottom on each side. Like so. Then you have 11 bolts that go around the outside. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11. So there you have it, the timing chain cover. Lastly in this video is the timing chain. You will need 10 and 12mm sockets and a strong paper clip or 1.5mm pin for this. Before removing the tensioner, it's advised to check the tensioner plunger protrusion. If it's over 16mm, then the timing chain is badly worn. I have a thing for over marking things, but before removing the chain I rotated the crankshaft lots of times with oil spilling out from the oil pump, but to show the blue coloured side plates on the chain. I have also marked all the arrows and line up markings with white paint. The idea being that the chain is in the correct refitting position even though we are removing it. So here you can see one of the blue links on the crankshaft, and the little punched tooth is underneath that blue plate. This is then showing the crankshaft keyway lined up with the arrow on the sprocket and the arrow on the engine block. This is the intake camshaft sprocket, and it's showing you the arrow and the punch mark is lined up with the blue location plate on the timing chain. This is the exhaust camshaft sprocket with the punch mark lining up with the blue side plate on the chain. And here's a view of the end of the camshafts showing the various markings and arrows. Normally those 3 blue side plates on the timing chain would rarely line up, as it takes a lot of engine revolutions for them to all coincide. I've only done that to show that there are 3 blue side plates and that they are there to help when we refit the timing chain after the engine repair. So now I have satisfied myself that everything is lined up correctly and extra white paint marks have been added everywhere, we can now proceed with removing the timing chain, hopefully in the safe knowledge that we know where it should all go on refitting. Here's a photo showing how to measure the protrusion of the plunger. To lock the tensioner back, I just pushed it back in with my hand, and it was easy enough to line up the hole and just pop a paper clip in to hold it securely. So the tension is then off the chain. So now the tension's off the chain, we can use a 10mm socket and just undo the 2 bolts that secure the tensioner into position. So here's 1 bolt out. There we are. And there's our paper clip. And then the second bolt just comes out, and then the tension drops off the chain. Here's a close-up of the tensioner. Got like a ratchet at the front by the look of it. And just keep the paper clip in there so that it's locked back. Now using a 12mm socket or spanner, we can remove the top run guide of the timing chain. That one seemed very tight, so I opted for a socket on that one. The socket soon got that shifted. So out comes that one. These are quite long bolts. Obviously you have to protrude all the way down into the cylinder head. So that's got like a standoff on it, that one. And then this one's just a standard bolt. Same length though. And there's the plate that sits above the timing chain. Now to remove the front run, which is held on with 3 10mm bolts. So using a 10mm socket, we just need to undo those 3 bolts. So here's our first bolt. And then our second one. Just checking they're the same length, and they are. And then our third bolt. Again, that's the same length, and then we can withdraw the run. We now need to remove the tensioner blade, and this is held on with a 6mm Allen key. So using a 6mm hexagon bit, we can then break that pivot bolt loose. It was actually quite tight, that one, so it did take quite a bit of effort. As they say, you need close fitting tools, and here it is. So this is the tensioner blade. So we're nearly ready to take the chain off now. Now we need to carefully remove the crankshaft position sensor and pop that somewhere safe. Definitely don't want to drop that. And lastly, we need to remove the timing chain. So just lift it off the 2 camshafts and out she comes. So that's the timing chain. Thank you for watching, and please see part 4 in this series.